With Hi-Fi Rush being teased for release on Nintendo Switch, I expect you're going to see a lot of people coming out and starting to say the game was overrated, or at the very least, not as hyped up as it was supposed to be. We saw the same thing with Ori when the game got like such rave reviews on Xbox. Like we were told it was some innovative indie 2D Metroid-like experience, that it was like some phenomenal thing, and then you actually play it and it's kind of mid. And the same thing is true for the sequel, right? Xbox people like really tried selling that game as a top-tier Metroidvania, and in reality, Metroid-like, excuse me, a Metroid-like game, one of the best games in the genre ever produced, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. You really got the impression by when you watch people who talked about this game that they were paid shills talking about a genre that they didn't have a lot of experience with, right? Like it was really, really obvious with Ori. So much so that I kind of rejected Hi-Fi Rush simply on that premise alone. Is that like I had no faith in Xbox, I had no faith in the development team, I had no faith in the product, because we have seen this process play out before where this highly regarded Xbox game comes to other platforms and nobody cares, right? Halo fell off. Gears of War fell off, right? All of this, a Fable fell off. Like, the issue is that, like, anybody who plays platforms outside of Xbox will very quickly understand that, like, all of these Xbox exclusive titles are kind of terrible and they aren't worth talking about in any meaningful capacity. There are a handful of exceptions. I love Dead or Alive and Ninja Gaiden, but like generally speaking, that is true, right? Xbox just was never able to compete with other platforms. They had a very dedicated online group of fanboys because of like being the first to introduce like online play and normalizing like LAN parties and later Xbox Live. Like they were pretty ahead of the curve when it came to that kind of thing. But like when it comes to the games themselves, they are kind of mid. Perfect Dark is better than Halo, right? Like the difference in quality is obvious if you play both. If you're like someone who actually likes the genre and isn't just a secondary that just latched on because like, oh man, you can play Halo with a bunch of friends. Like when you actually look at Xbox as a whole, it's a mid platform. So much so that like even hardcore fans kind of admit it at this point, right? Like it's a dying platform, it's irrelevant, but they keep trying to do this thing where they keep trying to convince you that like, oh, we're going to try being more creative. We're going to try making our games more colorful. We're going to make them cartoony. We're going to make games the way that Nintendo makes them, right? And they've done this a couple of times, and every single time, like, people do the same thing where they just kind of go like, oh, Xbox would never make something like this. Like, you saw this with, like, Sunset Overdrive. You saw this with, like, Sea of Thieves. You saw this with, like, the Ori games. And, of course, you saw this with Hi-Fi Rush. A game that was billed as this major, innovative, like, action game when in reality, like, if the same exact game came out on Nintendo Switch, like, you just know that nobody would have cared about it. And that's a really good way to kind of gauge, like, whether or not this stuff is, like, actually legitimately popular, right? Would the same group of people praise the game if it was on Nintendo Switch? And the answer is no, right? You could have like put the game on Switch to begin with, make it a Switch exclusive, like change nothing about it, and like the same people who like tried pushing Hi-Fi Rush and Pizza Tower as major Game of the Year contenders are suddenly just not going to be talking about the game at all, right? That is the reality of this situation, is that Hi-Fi Rush was never able to stand on its own merits, but it was only being pushed to shill a product and to appease fanboys, right? That is the reality of this situation. I've been very critical of Hi-Fi Rush since it came out. It doesn't look impressive at all. The shilling it's gotten from YouTube sickened me. The fact that like so many YouTubers try to like bill this as some like major innovative action game when better games like Bayonetta 3 were like outright ignored. Like it was really, really pathetic to see. Like so many people go to bat for this game, and it really just goes to show you just where people's priorities are. Like they are going to try and talk about the Xbox product. They are going to talk about the PlayStation product. They are going to talk about the big new PC game because that's where the sponsorship money is, right? They are trying to just sell you a product. And we see this all the time with like, the No Man's Sky shilling and the Last of Us Part 2 shilling and like, we've seen this a lot, right? There are countless examples of this. But what it all comes down to is that these people, quote unquote, they're not actually people, like these people are desperately trying to paint themselves as an authority of what's good and what's not in order to get those clicks, in order to get those Patreon donations, in order to do those charity scams, looking at you, the completionist, in order to do like all this stuff that they're doing, they need you to pay attention to them. And they need you to believe that they're telling you about some cool, interesting indie project that you've never heard of, right? Like, and for Hi-Fi Rush, it was like a flash in the pan thing. It was pushed for like a month and like again during Game Award season, and then it just kind of fizzled out, right? Like it just was never all that popular. And looking at it now, looking at what like the developers are doing, well, Shinji Mikami left in shame. Like Tango Gameworks is done for good. Like I hope this is the beginning of the end of this studio and like their stain on Japanese game development history. Like every time Xbox has tried controlling a Japanese studio, tried establishing themselves as a powerhouse in the region, it's led to nothing but disaster, right? Tales of Vesperia is a really good example where like this really relatively like mid Tales game was really heavily praised and promoted because like it was an Xbox 360 exclusive for a long time, right? That was why the game was as popular as it was. And it wasn't until much later when people realized replayed the game, where they realized that like, oh, it's not that good, right? It was only shilled among certain groups of people because it was an exclusive. And that's what happened with Hi-Fi Rush. It was a mid-action game that was pushed to the forefront so that people could like dab on Forspoken and start promote Xbox, right? Like it was an Xbox versus PlayStation thing. It wasn't obvious to anybody who wasn't looking for it. It's not something that like anybody other than myself would ever bring up, but it is what happened. The game just isn't all that relevant. It's not important, it's not significant, it's not a good game, it's not worth talking about, but it's worth acknowledging whenever the industry tries to sell you on a product like this. And in Hi-Fi Rush's case, it was quickly forgotten, probably because it came out so early in the year. But you know, Baldur's Gate 3 was of the same ilk. Like there were a lot of games this year that the industry desperately tried to push onto the gaming public, and I hope that very soon people will start pushing back against this nonsense.